So as Ria has told us today, in the Celtic world is the feast of Samhain, although it begins at sunset, because for the Celts, the day begins with the darkness, which is the fertile womb out of which light emerges. So for the Celts, light and dark are not competitors, they're partners who dance together. So given that it's Samhain, that I'm a Celt myself, and that the veil is open, I want to go today on a kind of a wild ride across time and across dimensions. And I'm going to start with an experience I had on the 20th of November in 2012, shortly after Samhain in the year 2012. It happened down at the creek. I live on the mountaintop, and at the bottom is a creek called Pina Creek, and I spent a lot of time there. So here was an experience and an encounter I had there on the 20th of November, 9 years ago. And it's a long piece, so I hope make sure you're sitting comfortably. I call it The Gardeners. He looked ordinary enough, except his eyes were special. They were kind and gentle, but also had a piercing, timeless quality. I felt, perhaps for the first time in my life, completely seen and unconditionally accepted. And I wondered what he was doing sitting on the banks of Pina Creek. Only once before had I ever encountered a stranger there. He was chewing meditatively on a blade of grass, and I could sense that he was debating within himself whether or not to share a big secret with me. To make it easier for him, I sat a few feet away and plucked a blade of grass for myself. In my mind, I said, "Tell me if you think I'm ready." He turned and smiled and said aloud, "Okay, I will." He began to tell me the strangest tale I had ever heard, outdoing even Daddy Jim, my druidical storytelling grandfather. And here's what he said. Once upon a time, there was a garden in a very remote location. To be precise, it was just a rock garden. Nothing grew there except crystals, diamonds, gold, and coal, and such. Then a family of gardeners discovered it and happily set about planting it with all kinds of shrubs and trees and grasses. They tapped into underground reservoirs and laid on an irrigation system, and they brought in natural fertilizers from their home place. The garden flourished. Occasionally, they came back and did major weeding, plucking up many plants and replacing them with even more exotic ones. They began to graft flora from their own place, and the results were spectacular. Then they got really creative and began to genetically modify the plants. In time, this combination of planting, weeding, fertilizing, grafting, and genetic engineering led to a quantum leap. Fauna emerged from what had been, up to then, merely flora. Animals slithered and skipped, hopped and walked, ran and flew about the garden. Now the gardeners really warmed to their task. They continued grafting and weeding, fertilizing and gene splicing until a self-aware species evolved, tasked with turning free will, the ability to choose, into freedom, the ability to choose love. This program also allowed for the transition from self-preoccupation into compassion. The gardeners had conducted this experiment many times in many other gardens, but they could never predict the results. Sometimes free will simply morphed into greed and self-concern into violence. Such gardens inevitably self-destructed in a tangle of competing weeds that eventually choked all life in the garden. They reverted to being merely rock gardens. Others made a major shift. Life forms emerged that looked like the gardeners themselves. But no two gardens followed the exact same sequence. So the gardeners were fascinated to see what would become of their latest project in their newest garden. With great care, they coaxed it along right up to the self-aware phase and waited to see what would happen. This time, the new species split into 3 subspecies. I'll call them Homo naturalis, Homo spiritualis, and Homo sociopathicus. Homo sociopathicus used their gifts of free will and intelligence to try to take over the entire garden. They claimed it was theirs to exploit and quickly set about doing so. They were the takers, who believed that the garden was merely a resource. They began to fight among themselves for dominion and soon developed biological weapons to destroy life in parts of the garden they didn't yet own. Their weapons grew more and more deadly until, in their myopic greed, they invented weapons that could wipe out life in the entire garden. Meanwhile, Homo spiritualis had been using free will to become truly free, and their concern was for each other and for the garden. They could understand the languages of all the other life forms, flora and fauna, and wanted to ensure that all the other denizens of the garden had their needs met and their views respected. It was very quickly becoming apparent that these were the givers, and that would be the next phase of the evolution of the garden. They vibrated at a rate that transcended mere physical manifestation and could move in and out of their bodies at will. Filled with compassion, even for the takers, they attempted to awaken Homo sociopathicus to the catastrophe they were about to cause, but they were not afforded a hearing. Meanwhile, in the very remote parts of the garden, places even the takers hadn't discovered, there was a 3rd subspecies, Homo naturalis. Let's call them the innocents. These lived in aboriginal conditions with no outside contact. They'd never even heard or met any of the takers or even the givers. And they were blissfully unaware of the fate that awaited the garden. The unthinkable finally happened. Homo sociopathicus deployed nuclear and biological weapons in a frenzy of internecine warfare that got out of hand and soon killed the garden. But their leaders had long anticipated this possibility and had an escape plan. They took to the skies in their spaceships and abandoned the garden, leaving most of their own followers to die horribly in the radioactive cloud that enveloped the garden. Homo spiritualis had also anticipated the event. They simply ascended into other dimensions as they had practiced, leaving their physical spacesuits behind them. They traveled until they found other gardens in which they could switch interdimensionally between physical and non-physical forms. By a quirk of nature and the direction of the winds, somehow the innocents survived the Holocaust. They were now unwitting heirs to the entire garden. And in time, they traveled from their remote habitats and discovered the vast extent of their territory. Eventually, they too evolved, occasionally stumbling upon artifacts of the bygone civilizations of the takers and the givers. They told stories about these finds and theorized as to what wisdom and technology these civilizations might have had. Thousands of years passed, and there were rumors that strange, powerful beings had begun to visit from the skies. Some of these were benign and helpful, and these they called the gods. Others were malevolent and destructive, and they called these ones the demons. The gods attempted to encourage the innocents to move from free will to freedom. Whenever they found an innocent who could spontaneously shift into a state of consciousness that allowed him to surf other dimensions, they would teach him about great wisdom and about love. Occasionally, one of these ascended givers, gods, would agree to incarnate as an innocent and be born to a Homo naturalis woman, choosing to live a full life in a physical spacesuit and yet demonstrate unconditional love. The erstwhile innocents were now increasingly becoming more technologically adept and facing a new bifurcation point between their own version of takers and givers. So the incarnated ultra-terrestrials, the avatars, were often ridiculed, violently opposed, and even killed. It looked like, in Yogi Berra's famous phrase, déjà vu all over again. Meanwhile, the space-traveling Homo sociopathicus had found another garden, but conditions there were such that they had to seriously decompensate in order to live in it. It was a dark, sunless garden, so their eyes became huge in order to be of any use. The garden stank of foul odors, so their noses shrank to mere slits in order to ward off these smells. They had been so badly irradiated as they escaped the Holocaust in their original garden that both males and females became permanently sterile. They produced progeny by cloning, since mating was no longer possible. Eventually, their genitals atrophied and were no more. Over time, the lack of food in this garden meant that they no longer had a need for mouths to chew, digestive tracts to metabolize, nor elimination systems to dispose of waste matter. They survived by chemical infusions. Mouths now became mere gashes used only for communication, which eventually morphed into mind-to-mind telepathy. Their skin took on a pale, sickly grey color. Most devastating of all, and this had already begun to happen even during their final years in the original garden, their sense of humor and their ability to empathize totally atrophied. They were a race without either laughter or compassion. But they continued to evolve scientifically, and soon they cracked the riddle of time, learning to move backwards and forwards in it. When they journeyed forward, they encountered a reality of even more atrophy, stagnation, and darkness, born of their determination to continue to pursue technology bereft of intuition and spirit. So they decided instead to focusing on traveling backwards in time. Then things got very interesting. They figured out that by intervening in their own past, they could influence their now and so alter their future. They began a series of sorties to abduct, experiment on, and even harvest human and animal parts from the original garden as it had existed before the Holocaust. They were particularly interested in the physiology of the parts which they had lost through atrophy: nose, mouth, digestion, elimination, genitals. They were also experimenting on what had allowed humans to experience emotions. The objective of these harvests and experiments was to re-engineer themselves and reconquer the original garden, which was far more life-sustaining than their present one. Some of the leaders of the innocence becoming sociopathicus were aware of these incursions, but traded permission to continue with the abductions for new technology and training. So now, two versions of Homo sociopathicus existed, and both were attempting to use each other to conquer the garden. The givers, Homo spiritualis, had by now developed into angelic-like beings for whom compassion was the paramount virtue. Whenever they found an individual, a community, or a movement among the innocents becoming awake, they spoke to their souls, using them as channels to pour compassion into the garden, in a race against the possibility of a new Holocaust. They became more and more creative, writing hundreds of love letters each year in the fields of the garden. The awakening innocents called these love letters crop circles. My grass-chewing storyteller went silent for a few moments. Then he turned to me again and said, "You know, don't you, that there are two kinds of fractals? Fractals in space and fractals in time? Space fractals are the physical patterns that are identical in shape and that repeat on an infinite number of scales. Examples have appeared in some of the crop circles. But there are also time fractals, patterns of behavior and of history that also repeat on different scales. And that was what began to happen now in the original garden. The taker's return coincided with the technological evolution of the innocents become takers. These two waves amplified each other to create a tsunami of greed and destruction, which threatened to do far more damage than the first Holocaust had. There was only one solution. The givers joined with the innocents becoming givers to shift the consciousness of the very garden itself. The garden quantum jumped into the fifth dimension, becoming invisible to, and thus uninhabitable for, the two waves of takers. The second Holocaust did happen, but it resulted only in the destruction of the physical level of the garden. The two waves of takers wiped each other out and were no more. Karma is the butter spread evenly upon the bread of life under the blade of compassion. In time, the givers came to realize that their revisited past was a present from their distant future. He stretched his feet into the waters of Pina Creek, and we both went back to chewing on our blades of grass. Words inspired by God. The very first word in the very first book of the Bible is the word Breshit, which is commonly translated as in the beginning, except it's a mistranslation. Breshit does not mean in the beginning, it means in a beginning. If it had wanted to say in the beginning, it would have said Bareshit, but it didn't. It said Breshit. So the beginning was a beginning, not the beginning, because there have been very many beginnings and very many endings. And even if we go to science, if you think that the Big Bang was the beginning, you're mistaken. The Big Bang was simply a beginning. So if you ask a scientist the question, what happened before the Big Bang? The scientist will say that's a nonsensical question, because the Big Bang not only created matter and space, it created time. So you can't ask what happened before the Big Bang, because time didn't exist before the Big Bang. And we know from Einstein's formula E equals mc squared that at the speed of light, space shrinks to zero and time shrinks to zero. So there's only the here and the now. For the enlightened being operating at the speed of light, there is only the here and the now. So when you look at it, science, the scriptures, and the origin stories are not about the beginning. They're only about a beginning, of which there have been many. There have been very many beginnings and very many endings. And I'm going to talk about some of those today. So if you really want to access the true origins, you have to go trans-spatial. You have to go trans-temporal. You have to go trans-personal, and you have to go trans-rational. And that's where I'm attempting to go in the homily today. So I'm going to break the homily up into three parts. I'm going to talk about the history and mythology of creation. And then I'm going to talk about the present times in which we live. And then thirdly, about the future times that we face. So the history and the mythology of creation. We have to realize that in many, many different cultures, time is not a linear thing going from the past to the present to the future, but rather time is a cycle that repeats. And that's what I meant in this story. Fractals of time. We're living in repeated patterns of history and human error and human evolution. We're not just at the end of a process that began in Sumeria, 5,000 years BCE. We've been in this place many, many, many times. And so we have to realize that many of the creation stories or the origin myths that you find in the scriptures and in science's Big Bang are basically not creation stories. They're restoration stories. They're what's happened after a catastrophe and we're trying to restart life on planet Earth. Now, nature herself has been a major player in these beginnings and these endings. And so through natural disasters like cometary strikes, our planetary crashes, our magnetic pole shifts, our flooding, nature itself on a regular basis has destroyed and recreated and restored. There have been many, many beginnings and many, many endings. And so although the planet itself is 4.6 billion years of age, life didn't begin until 3.7 billion years ago. And then at that stage, some kind of a seeding went on. Some people would call this panspermia. Somehow the seeds of life migrated from elsewhere in the cosmos and landed on planet Earth. It's almost as if you take, for instance, a dandelion and you blow on it and it scatters the seeds, they go floating off. It's like they had no particular destination in mind. They were just going to go where they went and then plant themselves wherever they found themselves. So that in some senses, spores of life were created by some kind of a dandelion wind that scattered in space, and some of them landed on planet Earth. But the interesting thing is, although they landed 3.7 billion years ago, it was a very, very slow evolution. There's something in geological history called the Cambrian explosion. It happened between 541 and 530 million years ago. And it was the extraordinary, unparalleled emergence of organisms in the fossil record. Up to 541 million years ago, there was a very, very slow evolution. And when you look at the fossil record, there are very, very few life forms on the planet. And then all of a sudden, beginning 541 million years ago, there's this explosion of flora and fauna. Like nature was starting a brand new beginning of some kind. But 250 million years later, it changed its mind. And so 250 million years ago, there was what's called the Permian extinction. And this was the greatest mass extinction in Earth's history. Over 95% of marine life was wiped out, and over 70% of terrestrial species were wiped out in this Permian extinction. So here we have nature doing this, many beginnings and many endings, left to our own devices even. So that's one source of the beginnings and one source of the endings, and one source of the restorations after the endings. A second source would be extraterrestrials and what we call the gods. At one stage, Francis Crick, the co-discoverer of the DNA molecule, was being interviewed on BBC, and he was asked, how can he account for life on planet Earth? And he said, panspermia. And the questioner said to him, well, how did the seeds get to planet Earth? And he made this extraordinary claim. He said, they came on specially designed interstellar craft. In other words, it was a directed panspermia. It wasn't just, seeds floating somewhere in space and hoping to land someplace. He called this directed panspermia. This is the co-discoverer of the DNA molecule, claiming that special craft brought life forms onto planet Earth, and then it began to evolve. So and he was asked, how did this happen? So either these were remotely controlled craft, or there were actually ETs on board these. And when you look at all the great wisdom traditions of the planet, there are stories in all the traditions about great floods, about wipeouts, about genetical modification happening many, many, many times. In fact, civilization has been restarted many times with help from above, according to these stories. A particularly important event happened in the year 12,900 years ago. It's called the Younger Dryas period. It was a time when the North American continent was covered in ice 2 miles thick, just like Antarctica is right now. And some kind of an extraordinary comet fractured above North America and sending thousands of pieces that melted the ice sheet so quickly that it raised the water level all over the world by 200 feet. And then in some places, the fires landed in woodland and set fire to the planet. And for over 1,000 years, the sun was wiped out because of the polar smoke. So it ushered in another mini ice age. And that's called the Younger Dryas period. It lasted from 12,900 years ago for almost 1,300 years. Right around that period, the earliest artifact we've ever discovered archaeologically is a place in southern Turkey called Göbekli Tepe. And they've begun to discover extraordinary buildings and columns which had been intentionally buried under a mound of clay. And it goes back to that period of time, 12,900 years ago. It's the oldest, edifice ever discovered. It's huge. It's like a mini city, but it's intentionally covered over, as if some kind of a civilization wanted to cover up the evidence of their existence so that future generations could uncover it and find out what happened. When you look at the world mythologies, every single group has stories about sky beings, gods of various kinds, coming to Earth and sometimes wiping out the Earth. The oldest extant one is the Sumerian version. The oldest form of writing on the planet is cuneiform, which came from Sumeria about 5,000 years BCE. And they talk about the Anunnaki coming to Earth, harvesting the Earth, and modifying, hominids on the Earth at the time, and then getting so upset with human behavior that they decided to send a flood. In Hinduism, we've just heard the great story of Lakshmi this morning. Hinduism talks about these Mahayugas, these great periods of time that cycle again and again and again, where we reenact the same fractal again and again. Hinduism talks in very graphic, specific technological detail about Vimanas, a spacecraft which, it came from the heavens and fought internecine battles among themselves. There are places on the planet where there has been the vitrification of sand, which can only happen if there's some kind of a nuclear holocaust takes place. So there is evidence that there have been nuclear holocausts long before, 1945. So the Sumerians were there, the Hindus were there, and the Hebrews got there. In the great story in Genesis that I just mentioned, the very first word in the very first book of the Bible is "in a beginning." It's about a restoration. And then 6 chapters into it, there's another wiping out. God wipes out, in a flood, the entirety of creation and just saves a 2 of each species because he repents. So there's a restoration of life on planet Earth. And in Mesoamerica, there's this extraordinary, beautiful account of the Popol Vuh, which was almost all of the writings and all of the scriptures of Mesoamerica were destroyed by the conquering Spaniards. But one, Spanish priest rescued this document and transcribed it and interpreted and translated into Spanish. That's called the Popol Vuh. And it's the Mesoamerican version of exactly the same thing. Sky beings who come down to restore the planet after a global catastrophe. So in the past, there are many, many accounts of these many beginnings and these many endings. So that's the kind of a historical review. I want to look now at what that says to us about the times in which we live. And I want to make a distinction here. If you know anything about surgery or about surgical procedures, there are a lot of procedures that end with the word ectomy, and there are lots of surgical procedures that end with the word otomy. And the difference between them is this: ectomy means that the whole organ has been removed, and otomy means that a part of it has been removed. So for instance, an appendectomy means that the entire appendix has been taken out. Or a hysterectomy means that the entire uterus has been removed. Whereas colostomy means that there's a hole put in the colon to put a bag so that you can drain. A tracheotomy means there's a hole in the throat so that you can breathe. So there's a big difference between ectomies and otomies. Now, it seems to me, as I look at the world in which we live right now, that I'm going to call it a soulotomy taking place right now. There's a hole being created in the cosmic psyche, and I'm going to call it tyranny. Tyranny is a soulotomy, where there's a hole being created in the cosmic psyche. And it's the antecedent to what I would call a soulectomy, transhumanism, the extinguishing of the cosmic psyche. It's the modern, iteration of the cosmic battle between light and darkness. We're in a battle, literally, for the soul of the planet and the soul of the cosmos. From those who perform a soulectomy, we call it transhumanism on the psyche. We look then at some of the tools they've used in order to create this kind of confusion and this kind of division among us. We're looking at a new form of systemic racism. I've quoted a few before. A sociology professor in New York State University, a woman called Jessie Daniels, who said that the white nuclear family is one of the most powerful forces supporting white supremacy. Forming a white family and having white children perpetuates racism. Her response was, if you really want to get rid of racism, you got to stop white people marrying white people and having white children. You got to separate them, even if they give birth to white children, so that they're not in intact white families. And very recently, a genius with the name Zeus Leonardo, who's a professor at Berkeley, said that he calls it whiteness theory, which means that children, he says, children are born human. But if they're raised by white parents, they're bullied into becoming white, which is a disease. So whiteness is a disease. And if you've been raised by white parents, you've been diseased beyond redemption. This is the new form of systemic racism. This is being built into the curricula of our schools, where little children are being forced to identify themselves as racists or as oppressors, holding placards over their heads, or the oppressed and the victimized if they're otherwise. This is the new form of systemic racism that's coming into our school system. We're looking at what I'm going to call slavery by mandate. The World Economic Forum is a group of elite people using their jets. Over 1,000 jets will go into Davos in Switzerland every year for this huge big meeting of the elite who determine the course of world history. The World Economic Forum, it's called. They have managed, using the pandemic of our times, to crash the economy, decimate the middle classes, and create over 150 brand new billionaires in just 2 years. This mandate, forced vaccinations, irrespective of your view on the vaccine itself. If you have any knowledge of history, even history of the 20th century, and any interest in justice, you must be appalled at the fact of the global apartheid which is being created, where people are going to have, like the Jews of Nazi Germany, where badges identify themselves as the ones who need to be careful about. We're going to have to carry passports. The mark of the beast in John's book of Revelation in chapter 13 said of not the end times, I believe, but an end time. He talked about the mark of the beast, where everybody, both small and great, both rich and poor, both free and slave, are to receive the mark of the beast on their right hand or on their forehead, so that they can only buy or sell if they're wearing this. And this is what we're seeing in our times. This mandate, which is creating a situation where people who have been frontline heroes in 2020, the nurses and the doctors and the firefighters, are now being regarded as domestic terrorists. I came across a case very recently of a woman who needed a kidney transplant, and her very good friend is a donor. And they went to their hospital in Colorado, and she was refused the procedure because she wasn't vaccinated. Just in the last 2 weeks, I've had 2 different young women contact me about situations in which they're going to lose their livelihood unless they accept this forced mandate. One of them is a musician with a traveling group, and she's been told that she cannot appear at a particular venue unless she has some kind of religious exemption, which I wrote for her. Another young woman is the mother of 2 young children. She's been working in the same profession very, very successfully for 16 years, and tomorrow, November 1st, she's going to be fired because she refused to accept a mandated, forced, invasion of her body, out of integrity. This is what I mean by slavery by mandate. I look at this extraordinary kind of domestic terrorists, where we are branding mothers of concerned school children. We're calling them domestic terrorists, and we're setting the FBI to investigate them. There's a case in Loudoun County in Virginia where, in an effort to kind of be so woke that boys who decide whether or not they're girls, and there's this boy going to school wearing a dress and declaring he's a girl, and he's allowed into the girls' bathroom, and he rapes a 14-year-old child. And the school covers it up and moves him into a different school in the same school district, and he does the same thing, rapes the second girl. And the father of the first girl attends a board meeting of the school board to object to what's happening, and they call the police, and he's wrestled to the ground, and he's arrested. There are sex education booklets in some of our schools right now, which are showing young boys how to do oral sex on each other, illustrated with one kid kneeling down, receiving the male member of the other kid who was standing up. This is the education that's happening in our schools right now. But people who object to that, they are the domestic terrorists, and now we're forcing the FBI to investigate mothers and fathers who are concerned about the dismantling of our culture and the perversion of our children. That's where we stand right now. It's the present. And what about the future? If there is to be a global catastrophe of any kind, whether it's climate change induced or whether it's a nuclear holocaust, there will be no evidence of civilization, and there will be no survival skills. Only the primitives, the people I called in my story, the innocents, they will be the only survivors. Those living in remote areas, through some kind of luck, they're the only people who will survive. There'll be no evidence of civilization. All our great buildings, all our great technology, there will be zero evidence of it. Nature will swallow it up. And the only record of where we've been will be the oral stories, which will survive in the archives of the human mythology to teach us about how we learned and what we refused to learn. But during that process, before that catastrophe happens, if it is to happen, and during the catastrophe, there will be three groups, as I said in my story this morning. There will be Homo spiritualis, the givers in my story, who are identified with their soul self, acting out of wisdom and a love and compassion for everybody. And there will be a second group called the Homo sociopathicus, the takers in my story this morning, who will identified with their spacesuits, acting out of greed and acting out of violence. And then there will be a third group, whom I've called Homo artificialis. Humans who have been modified through artificial intelligence to be basically reprogrammed slaves for this Homo sociopathicus that survives. And these will have no rights whatsoever. And that's precisely what the World Economic Forum is telling us. You will have, under the Great Reset, there will be no rights. You own nothing and you'll be happy. You won't even own your own children. There will be no freedom of religion. That'll be wiped out. There'll be no freedom of assembly. There'll be no freedom of travel. There'll be no freedom of expression, and there'll be no freedom of thought. But you'll be happy because Big Brother is looking out for you. That is the future we face unless we wake up. But I want to tell you that there have been many other endings and many other beginnings in the history of this planet. Our job, in my opinion, is to oppose and confront Homo sociopathicus, to refuse to become Homo artificialis, and to commit to conceiving, carrying, and birthing Homo spiritualis. Namaste, my brothers and sisters.